Hi everyone, this is Sam Black with Drafting Archetypes, and today I'm going to be discussing multicolor decks in Aetherdrift. As always, the notes are available to follow along at patreon.com/draftingarchetypes. I've talked a lot about how I don't like splashing in this format, and I mostly draft two-color decks, and that's pretty unusual for me. In most formats, I think I draft two-color decks less than half of the time, but here, for a variety of reasons that I've discussed, it just doesn't seem to work out. I think that the fixing isn't very good for like two colors plus a splash. The and the reason for that is basically that you have like hard fixing in the form of 3 mana cards like Starting Column and Veloheart Bike, and then you have the common dual lands and Night Market, the land that cycles and you can choose a color that it taps for when it enters. And I believe that those common lands are actually less common than other commons by a somewhat appreciable amount based on how packs are collated. Like those cards occupy the land slot like half the time or something, and the result is that there are fewer of any particular land than there are any particular other common. I think that that's right. Might be wrong, but I am pretty confident it's right. And you're looking for very specific lands when you're trying to splash, and so you kind of have to take them when you see them if you're trying to get them, which means spending somewhat high picks on them, and you need like a decent number of them if you're like fixing almost exclusively off the lands, and there aren't like very easy ways to fix otherwise. And so you end up needing to spend more like premium-ish picks to have good mana in a 3-color deck or 2-color with a splash than I think that you're usually getting paid for it, and it's better to just spend those picks on better cards for your 2-color deck most of the time. But the situation's a little bit different when it comes to drafting like 4 or 5-color decks. Molt Tender, Veloheart Bike, and Starting Column. Molt Tender's the green uncommon 1/1 for 1 that can tap to mill a card or tap and exile a card in your graveyard to add a mana of any color. Veloheart Bike is 2 and a green for a 4/2 vehicle that gains 2 life when it enters and taps for a mana of any color. And Starting Column is the Start Your Engines 3 mana artifact that taps for mana of any color, and when you have max speed, you can tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards and discard a card. All of those are hard fixing, the kind of fixing that pushes toward 5-color, meaning that they both offer a mana of any color, and unlike Night Market or similar, they don't make you commit to a single color. So Night Market's a little bit awkward in a 5-color deck because you draw a hand with 2 different basic lands in a Night Market, you choose a 3rd color for your Night Market, and now this card that you were kind of counting as a pip for everything doesn't let you cast cards in 2 of the colors in your deck. So there's an appreciable difference, especially with 5-color decks, between the flexible 5-color fixing and the fixed 5-color fixing. And in this set, a lot of the most of the non-land 5-color fixing is the like flexible kind that works well in 5-color decks, as opposed to the narrow kind that works better in 3 or 4-color decks. And so that kind of means that if you're building your deck around actually playing like Veloheart Bikes and Starting Columns, you kind of might as well try to prepare for all the colors to be able to take the best cards you see and get the most value out of the fixing. Night Market isn't as good at enabling 5-color decks, but it's still a card that a 5-color deck really wants over like a basic land or something. So you're still going to prioritize that highly in the draft, along with just all the dual lands, because when you're trying to play a 5-color deck, your mana base is going to be, it's not going to be as good as you want, and every extra pip that you can find in your mana is going to be pretty valuable. So because the 5-color decks kind of exist because of Veloheart Bike and Starting Column, and the fact that those aren't high picks means that you're like planning to see them and planning to draft around using them. And the key to drafting around that is to have a curve and like kinds of cards that play well with manoliths. Manolith being 3 mana colorless artifact, tap for a mana of any color. A good kind of stand-in for all of that sort of effect. Anytime you're trying to actually put manolith type cards in your deck, you want to have a lot of cards that impact the battlefield for 2 mana so that you can take turn 3 off and not fall too far behind. And then you want to have like very high battlefield impact cards that cost 5 mana so that after taking a turn off on 3, you can recover by playing a 5 that'll stabilize or catch up or pull you ahead. Also, the more ones you can have, the better. The ones make it even easier to take off on 3 if you played a 1-on-1 and a 1-on-2. However, if you're playing a bunch of tapped lands, that makes ones more awkward. But you can make up for that with the fact that the manoliths enter untapped. So you can go turn 1 tap land, turn 2 2-drop, turn 3 manolith 1-drop. And now, assuming that 1-drop can actually like trade with some things, you've managed to like make a play that impacts the battlefield on both 2 and 3. And now going into the late game, you should be pretty stable and good to ride your extra mana and more powerful cards that you've presumably drafted based on the fact that you had access to cards of every color while you were drafting. And you should be good to go from there. So basically what you want to do is you want to avoid 3s and minimize, like you want to minimize 3s and 4s, planning to have a curve that spends turn 3 developing your mana. If some of your turn 3 develop your mana cards are Path Cruisers, the 6/5 vehicle for 3 that searches for a basic, then you would still want a lot of 1s and 2s, but you wouldn't want 1s as much because you won't get the 1 mana rebate on turn 3, and you'll want some stabilizing 4s like Hazard of Dunes rather than just stabilizing 5s, because while Path Cruiser fixes your mana a bit, it doesn't accelerate you to 5. So you do want to think about what your fixing is and how it impacts your curve and draft a curve that works with your fixing. This is going to affect mostly, your like picks 5 through 10, where, the early picks, you're kind of just taking the strongest cards. The late picks, you're taking like whatever's sort of playable. But in the back half of the middle of the pack, there you're often going to be choosing between kind of similar cards. You're probably going to be taking fixing over most stuff. But then, as far as like, there are a lot of packs where there's like a kind of playable filler like 3 or 4-drop and a kind of playable filler like 2-drop. And you'll want to be taking like the 2-drops in that spot. So I really think that drafting that kind of curve and like being able to use the 5-color fixing well is the most important thing in planning to draft 5-color. But there's still quite a bit more to discuss. So because the good fixing costs 3, your mana will be good on turn 4 forward. But on turns 1 and 2, your mana will not yet be fixed. You're going to be relying on the lands in your deck to cast your spells. And so it's best if you can choose 1 or 2 base colors and really focus on trying to make your 2-drops cards that are in your base colors, or cards that are like really good that you're happy to try to double spell with after turn 3. But as far as you're just like filler, playable, I'm trying to defend myself type 2-drops, you want to make sure that you can cast those. And Ticket Tortoise and to a lesser extent Walking Sarcophagus are acceptable ways to make sure that you can do that, especially if you're stretching your mana even like harder. But most of the time you're going to want to choose 1 or 2 base colors, and because of Veloheart Bike, and to a lesser extent Pothole Mole and Molt Tender, one of those base colors is usually going to be green. So you choose green and another color to be your early drops, and then With your expensive stuff, you can basically just play whatever. Though you do want to try to avoid things that cost multiple pips of colors that aren't your base colors, ideally. If they're strong enough, you can try to make it work. Sometimes your base color will point you toward themes that your deck can include. Exhaust or artifact matters are both things that I think make sense that I've had incorporated in multicolor decks. In general, like working some synergies in rather than just like, here's, no thought, bunch of strong cards on a reasonable curve. Like, synergies add power to your deck. They're worth thinking about. So I did make a list of commons that I would prioritize more highly in 5-color decks than other decks based on their casting costs and the kind of roles that they fill. It's hard to read a long list of cards in an audio form podcast, and I really don't want to, read 20 cards and then also say what all of them do. We're pretty late in the format. I'm going to go over this list. If you don't know what any of the cards are, don't worry about it. Just try to get the basic idea here. So first, you're looking for like 1 mana stuff that is reasonable and or like tempo positive or good defensive plays. So like Bounce Off, Dynamite Diver, Engine Rat, Grim Bauble. Scrap Compactor is not exactly that, but it is colorless removal spell that spends your spare mana pretty well. Then you're looking for ideally green defensive 2-drops. So stuff like Gibberick Omnivore, Lightning Strike, Run Over, Skystreak Engineer, Ticket Tortoise, Venom Sack Lagak, Wreckage Wicker Folk. So Wicker Folk is giving you some card selection. Ticket Tortoise is colorless, so you can always play it, and sometimes it's going to fix your mana, like give you a treasure to let you cast other stuff. Run Over is not the kind of thing that I would generally want as a defensive 2-drop because it isn't one, because it needs you to have a creature in play to do anything. But it pairs really, really well with Velo Heartbike. As long as you have a 2-drop, you can play Velo Heartbike, and then as long as you remember to tap your Velo Heartbike for mana before you crew it, you can tap it for a mana, crew it, and then use it, like target it and your opponent's creature with Run Over, and now you've generated a 1 mana removal spell at common, which is a big game as far as like a stabilizing tempo play. Then at 3, you're basically just looking at starting column, Velo Heartbike, and Pothole Mole. 4, again, you're mostly trying to minimize 4s, but Hazard of Dunes is very good. Nice, like the reach matters a lot. Good size helps stabilize. Like it's easy to get a lot of virtual card advantage out of Hazard of the Dunes, which is what you're looking for. And then Broadcast Rambler is a great way to stabilize. It gives you multiple bodies, a flying chump blocker, a large blocker. It's a really good thing to follow up Manolith. And then Hull Drifter is less good at stabilizing, but this kind of deck does want card advantage to make up for the fact that you have more mana sources in your deck. So to avoid flooding out, you need like stuff like Hull Drifter. And then Ride's End, really just a defensive 2-mana removal spell. Thunderhead Gunner, can't say enough about how good Thunderhead Gunner is here, especially given what I was just saying about needing to avoid flooding out and generating virtual card advantage and all that. And then Migrating Ketrodon. Good to accelerate into, blocks really well, buys you a bunch of life. Just the perfect card for this kind of deck. So those are like the commons to be looking for. But again, those are basically just the ones that I would value a little bit more highly in 5-color than in general. But of course, you want strong commons over weak commons. So this is just, these ones get a little bit of bump based on, curve and strategic fit. You want to prioritize lands very highly during the draft. And depending on what kind of fixing you get and what like spells you end up with, there's a decent chance that you'll end up cutting some colors in deck building. You kind of have to know that you're planning to draft this way before you've finished drafting this way. So you're making some picks anticipating some cards showing up later in the draft, and those cards may or may not do that. So if I start with like a 3-color rare, like a loot or something, and I'm like, okay, great, this is a very good reason to draft a multicolor deck. I'm going to look for fixing, and like because I'm going to be prioritizing Veloheart Bike to make it easier to cast my loot, maybe I'll also end up playing a black card, or maybe I'll want Rides in my deck. So I start drafting that way. I get a Veloheart Bike 5th pick. I take a Rides End that I see at some point because I'm, trying to get into this 5-color space. The draft keeps going, and, maybe I only see 0 to 1 more Manoliths. Maybe the lands aren't going late. I end up with a few of them, but not a big number. And I end up with, maybe like a Broadcast Rambler that I got 10th because that card sometimes goes very late. But I also just have enough playables in Teamer, and maybe I end up solid 3 Teamer, maybe I end up like blue-green splashing red for loot. And a lot of the time when I get to deck building, I'm going to end up deciding, you know what, I actually didn't see enough fixing, I'm not going to play the white, I don't need it. And so you want to draft anticipating that that might happen. And how much you value cards that aren't in your base color should change throughout the draft. Like the more fixing you get early and in the middle of the draft, the more you want to prioritize that stuff. The less you have and the later it gets, and the less likely it is you're going to see more of that fixing, the more you want to try to stick to your base colors. So this isn't like something that you want to hard commit to at the beginning of the draft. You want to stay very fluid with it and know what you're looking for and know how to make the deck work if it ends up letting you play a lot of colors. But this needs to be kind of like you're always pivoting and like gradually sliding into the actual 5-color space. So immediately before recording this podcast, I was streaming a draft that I went into being like, okay, you should not force 5-color. It doesn't make any sense. The reason to be 5-color is because you have powerful rares that require a lot of different colors, maybe premium uncommons that require a lot of different colors. You see the good fixing. You kind of naturally expand from a 2 or 3-color deck into a deck that's more colors. But knowing that I was going to be recording the podcast and wanting to kind of explore some of these play patterns, I was like, all right, I'm going to try to force 5-color. I started with Boros, deal 4 damage, flicker a creature or vehicle, getaway, explosive getaway. And I was like, okay, great start. Explosive getaway is really good in 5-color decks. And I ended up just not really seeing Veloheart Bikes or Manoliths or good blue and black cards. And I ended up seeing a lot of powerful, pip-intensive green and white cards, as well as some other good red cards to splash like Samut. And so I ended up playing a base green-white splash red deck that never really dabbled in blue or black because the draft didn't lead that way, and there was just no way to get there, no reason to get there. The format really often tells you not to, go super wide with your number of colors, even when you're looking to. I don't feel like in the seat that I had, 5-color could realistically have happened. The cards that I saw in my 3 colors every pick were just better than the cards that I could have taken if I were trying to have worse mana. And I feel like, as someone who kind of looks to be able to use cards of all the colors to like get more removal or whatever, it's been remarkable how often the packs don't lead that way. But also I have had very good 5-color decks, and I think it's important to know how to make those happen. But I do think that this absolutely is not something you can force or like plan on as kind of like a go-to strategy. It's just something to know to look for when it comes up. All of this stuff is basically just true of drafting 5-color in general. These principles would apply to drafting 5-color in a chaos draft. Many sets have manolith variants, and the 2s and 5s and manoliths curve is pretty broadly applicable. So this is kind of a rehash with, specific focus on this set of just here's how you draft multicolor. But as we are very late in this format, I believe next week will be my last week talking about Aetherdrift. It is nice to have, something that scales into evergreen content pretty well, especially with a multicolor set coming up. So, yeah, the reason to draft 5-color is, of course, to take advantage of any multicolor cards that, get opened later in the draft that no one can play. Or, if you, I've had some drafts where I just get, I open a strong gold card, I get past a non-overlapping strong gold card. I'm like, all right, let's make it happen. But this strategy is very rare focused. So you should only do it if you have the rares that reward you for prioritizing relatively weak commons like Valor Bike and Starting Column. This is one where, the draft chooses you, kind of, if you know to look for it. It's certainly possible to draft in a way where you never draft this deck, you never need to look for it. It's more possible to do that than to draft in a way where you're always this deck. But sometimes this is strong, and it's good to look for and good to know how to do. Again, of course, because you're going to be slow to develop due to taking a turn off to play mana sources and playing tap lands and stuff like that, obviously you don't want to try to race. This is not an aggressive deck. You're looking to have inevitability. That means you want to value versatile answers, 2-for-1s, sweepers, big, game-winning type creatures and stuff. And in this format in particular, because you're trying to have inevitability and you're trying to play long games, you want to make sure that you have answers to common things that will trump the inevitability of just having some card advantage and good creatures and stuff. So, for example, the blue mill artifacts, if your opponent has those and you're trying to play a long game and you don't have those, you don't have an answer to them, you're just going to lose. So you might want to slightly more highly prioritize having some versatile answers to artifacts like Broken Wings or Collision Course. And you also might want to do something like play Wreck Remover a little bit more highly than you otherwise would, or just play Wreck Remover to minimize your odds of losing to Push Limit, which is another kind of card that if you're trying to play a control game and your opponent is a Push Limit deck, you're just going to give them enough card time to fill their graveyard and cast Push Limit and kill you, and there aren't really fogs or counter spells that can save you. I think that it's probably better to main deck a Wreck Remover than a Spell Pierce if you're looking to not lose to Push Limit decks. You can, if you're playing best of 3, sideboard Spell Pierce. That's a great answer to Push Limit. But as far as in best of 1, you're going to want to, try to think about playing some cards that'll cover your bases against decks that will trump your push toward inevitability. And that's what I have to say about drafting multicolor. So I'm going to turn it over to Twitch chat for additional questions and comments. Before I get there, of course, I would like to direct your attention to consideration for checking out patreon.com/draftingarchetypes, the Patreon for this podcast, and cleanest way to directly support the podcast outside of spreading the word, leaving reviews, and telling your friends, all of which is greatly appreciated. So, with that said, chatters, do you have questions for me? Can you speak to the difference of being patient in limited versus constructed? I often find that I sit on my removal too often in limited and allow my life total to get precariously low. Yes. In constructed, threats are very strong and snowbally, and in like modern standard, it's very hard to be patient with removal. You are basically trying to just like line up your mana with your opponent's mana and kind of just like kill all of their threats. Um, because any threat that stays around is going to snowball. There are some exceptions, especially if we're talking about like, your aggressive decks that have fewer removal spells that they're trying to use on bigger swings. And when we're talking about, not should I spend my mana or not spend my mana, but should I spend my mana on a removal spell, or should I spend my mana developing my board? That's a bit of a different question. But, in constructed, you kind of have the amount of removal that your deck is designed to want. Like, you're not limited in the amount that you see in a draft. You can just play all removal if that's what you want. And the threats are, it's not like your opponent has some bombs. Their threats are all the good rares they wanted to play. So for the most part, like, being patient with removal is less of a thing in constructed. In limited, there are a lot of reasons to be more selective with your removal spells. The concept of like virtual card advantage, holding off multiple like attackers with a larger defensive creature, is a little bit more real in limited. Like, that can happen in constructed, but a lot of the time, your opponent is just going to be able to like efficiently kill the creature you're trying to block with. Whereas in limited, a lot of the time, you can be like, okay, well, my opponent has a 2/2 they're hitting me with, but in a couple turns, I'm going to have a creature that invalidates their 2/2, so I don't want to have to use a removal spell on that, because it's just not going to be a card soon, and they might play something really powerful that I need the removal spell for. So a lot of the time that it's most clear that you want to be patient with a removal spell, like not just fire it off to preserve a bit of life total, is when there's a very likely, like, a clear path to getting to a point where their creature doesn't matter anymore. If their creature is just going to continue to matter, and you're likely to have to use a removal spell on it at some point regardless, you might as well use it before losing some life. But if you're about to blanket, then maybe first try to blanket, and then if they have an answer to your thing that blanks it, maybe then you have to use the removal spell. So, one example of that might be your opponent plays some kind of flying creature that doesn't cost a lot of mana, and you have a cheap removal spell that could kill the flyer, but you don't use the removal spell because you have a reach creature that you're going to play. So you take a hit for a damage or two once or twice, you play your reach creature, you expect that your opponent's small flyer is not going to matter anymore. If they kill your reach creature and your deck doesn't have a lot of other reach creatures, and the damage that you're taking from that is enough damage that you're not going to just like clearly outrace it, now you might have to like use your removal spell on that reach creature and wish you'd done it earlier and preserved some life. But it was a worthwhile gamble because you thought that your reach creature was reasonably likely to stay alive and block their thing. I think that that's as deep as I know how to go on that question as a general statement right now. I've had pretty good results with multiple starting columns to cast off-color bombs and removal. Hitting maximum speed lets you cast them in around turn 7+. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this strategy. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the heart of what I'm talking about, is drafting a curve that allows you to plan to play multiple starting columns so that you can cast whatever. And yes, being able to get rid of your starting columns after you no longer need the fixing is very useful. Starting columns, I think in general, are a little bit weaker than Veilheart Bikes, but very much better than a generic Manolith. As a general standard, I draft with bread in mind. Is that still applicable at higher skill levels? So, bread, for the uninitiated, is an algorithm that suggests the order in which cards should be prioritized. Bombs, removal, evasion, And I think there's some debate about what the last letters mean. I believe that it's like attack and defense, which is basically like good attackers and then blockers. I wouldn't say that it's a thing that I have ever thought about while drafting, but I mean, clearly you should take bombs over everything. That's what a bomb is. And then removal in general is good, although, there's like premium removal, which is generally better than creatures, and then there's like filler removal, and there are a lot of creatures that are better than that. And like what constitutes a big enough bomb to take over what kind of removal spell is always like easily debated. The rest of it gets complicated. Like I don't I think it's very easy to read, oh, take evasion next and be like, all right, well, I guess I will take this Wind Drake because it's an evasive creature. Like there are a lot of flyers that are just not very good. And I don't think that like in general, just being like, yeah, having an evasive keyword is like how I'm going to decide which creatures are better. Similarly, I don't think this has more power or attacks well is a good way to decide which creatures are better. So, like, I think you should prioritize bombs removal is kind of a cleaner and more accurate statement than like the bread thing, but I don't know. Bounce off and other unsummon like effects always perform better in the hands of better players. What do you see better players doing that others don't? So, the reason that bounce is good is that it's extremely versatile. It's really cheap, and sometimes you just need to bounce your opponent's 2-drop to like slow the game down. And often when you bounce the 2-drop, like if your opponent was going to curve out, that thing is as good as dead because next turn they're going to play their 3, and then they're going to play their 4, and then they're going to play their 5, and they never have an opportunity to play the 2 again. Other times, you will use it when your opponent plays a combat trick, and you will have answered their combat trick 1-1, but also your opponent's creature won't be there anymore, and it'll be very mana positive, a good tempo play. Other times, your opponent will kill a creature of yours that matters a lot, and you will protect that creature. In general, the more options a card has, the more skill testing it is. It's pretty easy to figure out what to do with a Grizzly Bear. You cast it when you have 2 free mana, you attack when your opponent doesn't have a blocker, and you block when your opponent attacks you with a 3/2, or if you have 2 Grizzly Bears, you can block a 3/3, or it's probably fine to block any 2-drop or whatever. It's generally pretty straightforward. It's even easier to cast. I don't know, whatever. The very straightforward card, like the cards that don't have a lot of options, are not very skill testing. A removal spell is a little bit more skill testing. You have to decide what to kill and when, and the discussion above about being patient with your removal. A bounce spell is you don't know if you're going, like when you draw it, you often don't know if your plan is going to be to target your own card or your opponent's card. So you have a lot more reasonable options with it. So it's mostly about just being able to navigate a card that gives you more options. And then sometimes it's about walking your opponent into a spot that creates a moment that is particularly good for the unsummon. So if you can generate a spot where your opponent is double blocking, or you can generate a spot where your opponent is using a trick and you can like bounce it and effectively counter the trick. Like if you can generate actual card advantage or card parity with a bounce spell, you're usually up a lot of mana. And for better players, that spot will happen more often because they'll know how to set it up and know to try to set it up. Whereas like weaker players might not navigate the game to that spot. What are your thoughts on cheating on splash lands if the card can cycle, like Thundering Broodwagon, Valor's Flagship, Migrating Ketrodon, so you still get some value? I forgot to mention this. I actually included it in my notes, but overlooked it. I think that you should not. I think one of the biggest traps in drafting multicolor in this set is exactly doing that thing. Playing cards, not with the specific cards listed, but playing cards that you wouldn't otherwise play because they cycle for 2 colorless mana, and you're like, well, if I can't cast it, I can cycle it. So this will be great. My mana, I can get away with slightly worse mana. Spending 2 mana to cycle a card and not generate any other effect should be seen as a disaster. It should never be a core part of your game plan. It should not be a factor in choosing to put a card in your deck. If you're planning to cycle a Thundering Broodwagon because you're planning to reanimate it, that's valid. If you're cycling a vehicle because you're planning to push the limit, that's valid. If you're like playing Thundering Broodwagon because you have 2 black sources in your deck, maybe you'll get both of them and you can cast it, but most of the time you're just going to like discard it and try to find something else. No. Spending 2 mana to cycle is so bad. You're just like 2 is a criminal amount of mana to like go down to not accomplish anything. And in your deck that's like playing extra mana sources to make your extra colors, like your extra, like when you're playing a bunch of manaliths and stuff, you can't just cycle your spell and draw into more mana. Yeah, don't like splash Trip Up as like, oh, this is a playable removal spell in my deck with like 6 blue sources, and if I don't have one, I'll cycle it. Just like play a card you can cast instead. As far as like, Valor's Flagship, like, yeah, you should play that card. It's just really good. If you have a lot of white mana, you can cast it. If you have a single white mana and a bunch of colorless mana and you're not about to like get to triple white and you cycle it for some guys, like, great. Migrating Ketrodon, it has cycling, I guess. I'm not planning to cycle it. I'm planning to cast it. I'm putting it in my deck. But I think that, this set can easily suggest that you should be thinking about cycling these cards that just like have cycling, when you should really try to avoid doing that. Overly simple question. Is cycling 2 a trap in 2025? Sounds like it. Yes. The only card that I really like cycling 2 on is Gallant Strike, and that's because the card's like so good and efficient, but there are some matchups or some situations where like, it's clear that you're not about to cast it and you just cycle it. But again, I'm not like planning to cycle that card when I put it in my deck, but I think that that's the cycling card that I find myself cycling most often, that costs 2 or more mana to cycle, that doesn't generate any effects. All right, I think that's going to wrap it up for this week. As I mentioned, next week I believe will be my last episode covering Aetherdrift. So it's been a fun set, but I'm looking forward to Tarkir. I believe that there will be a poll for what we should wrap up with coming up next week, and then the following week we should have enough information to talk about Tarkir. So that's all for now. Have a good week, and bye.
Prepare for light speed.